Elizabeth at A Literary Princess, and today I am doing my 10 worst books of 2021. So last week I did my best books. It only makes sense to do my worst books as well. And now you get to listen to me rant for however long about these books. So just a disclaimer, if you like these books, please don't be offended. I'm not saying they're bad books. I'm not hating on the authors. I'm hating on one author, but he's been dead for over a century, so it's okay. It doesn't mean that I think that you have bad taste as a reader. I just didn't like these books personally. That's my taste. There are people who I really respect and admire who love some of these books, so please don't be offended. I just didn't like them. All right, we are gonna start with the least bad and go down to the absolute worst. So let's get going. Sitting at number 10 is Middlemarch by George Eliot. I read this because I know I'm going to need it on my qualifying exam list. It follows 3 women in this town of Middlemarch and their romantic relationships. We've got Dorothea Brooke, Rosamund Vincy, and Mary Garth. I have issues with George Eliot. I really love some of her books, and then others I either hate or can't get through. This was actually my 3rd try at Middlemarch and my first time finishing it. I find her very pretentious in a way that just turns me off, and she also just goes on so long about things I don't care about. So I actually really loved parts of this. I adore Mary Garth. I thought that the relationships that all the women had were really interesting. Watching that all develop was great. The problem was in between that was just all this stuff about the politics of Middlemarch that I just did not care about. And it just went on and on. And it was such a slog for me. So I don't think this is a bad book by any stretch of the imagination. I gave it 3 stars. I think George Eliot's writing is beautiful. I just wish she had, this is like an 800 something page book. I feel like we could have had the main plots done in 400 pages if she just hadn't been going on about everything. So not a bad book. Again, I know a lot of people who love this. I can understand why. I do want to reread it at some point and see if maybe I can appreciate those slow parts more. But for this time, it's sitting at number 10. And I actually have put it on this list over books that are probably technically worse books, but I had such a hard time with this that it just needed to be on this list. Sitting at number 9 is Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. This is another case of, this is a very important book, big in feminist theory. It was for my feminist theory course. The ideas in this book are great. I just could not stand Butler's writing style. It is very filled with academic jargon, very long-winded, very hard, even though it's like very short book. I really struggled with this. And I used some of the ideas in my paper for the course. It's a very important book. It needs to be on my qualifying exam list. I just really struggled with it. I think I gave it 2 stars, but really it's probably more of a 3. The writing was hard. Sitting at number 8 is one I don't have a physical copy of. This is Georgia Peaches and Other Forbidden Fruit by J. Robin Brown. This is a YA lesbian romance about a girl named Jo whose father asks her to go back in the closet when they move to this rural Georgia town. And she does, and then ends up forming a relationship with this girl at school named Mary Carlson, who's just discovering her sexuality. And Jo lies and says that she's also just discovering her sexuality. So obviously that causes issues. I actually had fun reading this book. I think that it was engaging, but I had a lot of issues with it. There was ableism toward this one character with a mental disability. And I mean, even the main characters that we're supposed to like were treating him very condescendingly, and it was just uncomfortable. The representation of the lesbian characters, other than Jo and Mary Carlson, was really oddly bad. Like, they were all predators, abusive, or just kind of jerks. And that was kind of uncomfortable, as opposed to Jo and Mary Carlson, who are like the good Christian girls. And then there's also just the way that the lying was dealt with. Spoiler alert, they end up together in the end, and like the lying is just kind of look past. Like, Mary Carlson's mad for a while, but they get over it. I don't know, it didn't really sit right with me, and I ultimately gave it 2 stars because of that. Sitting at number 7 is another one I don't have a physical copy of. This is Nothing But Blackened Teeth by Cassandra Shaw. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. I don't actually have the spelling in front of me right now. Sorry. This is a horror novella about this group of friends that goes to a haunted Japanese mansion because 2 of the group have always wanted to get married in a haunted mansion, I guess. It's very spooky. I really liked the horror scenes themselves. Very creepy. Atmosphere was great. Nailed that. Cover's friggin' amazing. I could not stand the characters. There was so little character development. I just could not care about them at all. They all have issues with each other, but none of it's ever explained. Like, it's clear something has happened, at least one thing, probably more based on the way they act, but none of it's explained. Our narrator has just gotten out of the hospital after a suicide attempt. None of that's explained. And it just made it so I couldn't care about the characters. And for horror, I need to have a strong connection with the characters, or else it just doesn't work for me. So this ultimately didn't work for me. I gave it 2 stars. Standing at number 6 is another arc that I don't have a physical copy of. This is Books Promiscuously Read by Heather Cass White. And I blame NetGalley for this rating. This is completely NetGalley's fault because they mislabeled it. They called it a memoir, and I love memoirs about reading. I was like, oh great, let's do this. It's not a memoir. White doesn't talk about her personal life at all. This is more of a academic discussion of why we read and like what goes into that. She does some literary analysis, and you know, I could have gotten over my expectations and enjoyed this if not for the first section of this book, which was just these platitudes about what reading is and is not. And it was like trying to be deep, but it felt very vague. And I didn't like it. I actually had to skip ahead. I was like, if this whole book is like this, I'm not finishing this. And thankfully it wasn't. It was a very short part, but it was enough, and it was right at the beginning. It was enough to make me really consider if I wanted to keep going with the book. So I gave that 2 stars. The rating might have been different if I'd actually known what I was getting into when I picked it up. So again, I blame NetGalley, which I do love NetGalley. All the love to NetGalley, but that wasn't a memoir. Standing at number 5 is a reread for me. So I didn't work my rereads into the main list for the best books, but I have for the worst books. I think it's just kind of different when it's like a book I adore compared to a book that I end up not liking. I don't know. Maybe that's just me. This is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I read this for my American Lit class. I previously read it my sophomore year of high school for my American History class. So obviously this was a big book that was anti-slavery, showing Black people as human. Wow. Abraham Lincoln said it was the catalyst for the Civil War, very important book, and I can appreciate it for that. There's actually some really great parts in it. Everything that happens at Legree's plantation is very interesting. That's the most engaging part of the book for me. I wrote my paper on that part. That was great, but the problem with this is A, it's too long, and B, there are too many plot threads that don't actually connect. So we've got Eliza and her escaping, and then we have Tom and him getting sold further down south. And the two plots are just ultimately not connected, so it felt almost like two different novels. There's a lot of parts that are just very slow and boring, and I'm like, oh my God, can we please move on, get to the exciting stuff? And then there is the racism, which it was very progressive for its time, but to a modern reader, there's a lot of uncomfortable things in here. Again, it's a product of its time. We have to keep that in mind, but it did keep me from enjoying the book more. Sitting at number 4, and I actually debated between where to put this one and where to put Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were flip-flopping for 4 and 5 for quite a while. This is another reread. It is The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton. So I originally had to read this for my American Lit class in high school. We had to pick 3 books by one author and do a project on them. So I picked Edith Wharton because somebody told me she's the American Jane Austen. And whoever told me that lied. Because Jane Austen has happy endings, and this does not end happy. None of Wharton's things end happy, which is fine. I don't mind an unhappy ending, but I minded this unhappy ending. So this book follows Lily Bart, who's kind of in this high society circle, and she knows that she needs to get married to somebody wealthy. And she ends up poor and ostracized, and it's not a happy ending, as I said. I hated all of Wharton's books when I read them in high school. And then a few years ago, I picked up The Age of Innocence again, because I was like, maybe this isn't so bad. And I loved it. It was beautiful. I adored it. Loved Wharton's writing, loved the characters, very touched by the story. So I thought that I would have the same reaction to The House of Mirth. I did appreciate Wharton's writing. She's a very good writer. But these characters, I could not stand these characters. I hated them all so much, and it made it so painful to read about them. The ending, I hated the ending. So you can see in my copy, I had to annotate it for high school. Maybe you can see, I don't know. I just went on a rant at the end. I was so angry. And I had basically the same reaction as I did in high school when I read it this time. I was just furious. So yeah, that's number 4 on the list. Number 3 on the list, we're in the top 3 worst books to me. This is another reread that I have read 5 times, and I've hated it every time. It's actually gone up in my esteem since the last time I reread it. It used to be a 1-star read. It is now a 2-star read. This is Walden by Henry David Thoreau. So this obviously chronicles Thoreau's time at Walden Pond, living in a cabin in the woods. I have all kinds of problems with Thoreau. I think he's pretentious. I think that he was condescending to actual poor people, and we have records of these conversations in Walden of him being like, well, you should just do what I've done, and then you'd be able to have to be okay. And it's like, Henry, you are living on a plot of land owned by your friend Emerson that you don't have to pay for. You go to dinner at the Emersons constantly. You are not actually in the woods. You're a mile from town. You go to town all the time, and you bring your laundry in for somebody to do it there. Don't speak to me. So yeah, I have issues with Thoreau. This is the author I'm hating on, if you're wondering. I had to read this for my American Lit class. I did this time acknowledge that there is beautiful writing in this book. His descriptions are gorgeous. There is literary merit. Some of his musings are very lovely. And that is why it is now 2 stars. I'm like, okay, yes, I can appreciate some aspects of this, but I still hate it. I still hate Thoreau, but it is a beautiful piece of writing. It's an important work of American literature. I can accept that. So, number 2 on the list was for my independent study on Victorian women novelists. This was Bred Upon the Waters by Dinah Mulock-Craik. This was one of 2 books by Craik that I read. This is a very little known one. Like literally, I saw it mentioned once in a book I was reading. I was like, oh, maybe I should check that out. I wish I hadn't. This was so bad. I cannot describe how bad this was. The writing wasn't good, which was really surprising because Craik's other novel that I read, Olive, was pretty good. So I don't know what happened here. This was written for like some governess's society. So I don't know if that's why it was so bad. This is about a girl whose father gets remarried and then just kicks her and her brothers out of the house for them to fend for themselves. So she becomes a governess so she can support her 2 brothers who are like children. Weird concept. But so she's just suffering this whole time. And then finally at the end, you're like, oh, maybe this will go well and she'll get married to this guy that she's always been in love with. She gets in an accident caused by the guy. She ends up disabled and disfigured because of it. She can't walk and something happens to her face. I don't actually remember. The guy proposes to her just because he feels bad, but he's actually in love with someone else. And she's like, no, go marry who you love. And then we flash forward years into the future and she is still single and alone, but her joy comes from interacting with all of her nieces and nephews and the children of the guy that she was in love with that caused her to be disabled and disfigured. I was so mad with this book. I hated it. I gave it 2 stars. I don't know why. This should have been a 1 star. I think I was like, I can't give a Victorian novel 1 star. I'm a Victorianist. This is a bad book. I understand why it's not really in print anymore, why you can't find it. That's because it is bad. Awful, horrible, don't recommend it, should be forgotten. Ugh. So you might be saying, wow, that was number 2. What on earth could possibly be at number 1 that can top that? Well, this is Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. It's subtitled Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene. I read this for my feminist theory class. I gave this book 1 star. I don't give books 1 star. I can probably count on one hand the books I've given just 1 star to. And this is one of them. I hated this. And the bizarre part to me was that everyone in my class loved it. And I was just like, what? So this felt like listening to somebody describe their acid trip. And you as the listener have never taken acid, have never done any sort of drug in your life, and you have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. I did not get it at all. The back says that Haraway's offering provocative new ways to reconfigure our relationships to the earth and all its inhabitants. And like, it's very speculative. It's like almost sci-fi. It's like almost fiction, some of it. And I didn't get it. I couldn't stand it. I hated it. Even after several class discussions, I still don't get it. So if you can tell me what this is and like, why was this good? Please do, because I really want to know. Everyone in my class loved it. And I was just sitting there like, what? Please tell me. So this was the worst book I read this year. Number 1 star. So that is my 10 worst books of 2021. Please let me know down in the comments if you have read any of them and what you thought. Did you love them? Did you also hate them? Do you have any idea what Staying with the Trouble is saying? Because I do not. Please also check out my Tumblr and my blog down in the description box below. And I hope that you will like and subscribe to see more of me. It's been great chatting with you. I'll see you soon. Bye.